Rabbi, you are muted.
Good evening, everybody. That's because I hadn't started yet, Steve. How are you? How's everybody? Hope everybody is doing well. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Can everybody hear me okay? If not, then speak now or forever hold your peace, or at least hold your peace until you tell me you can't hear me. But welcome back to another episode, another installment of the Jewish Destiny series, the Jerry and Carol Harris Jewish Destiny series. We are continuing where we left off 2 weeks ago, and I hope that everybody had a wonderful Shavuos holiday last week, and we are now ready to go forward. I will just throw out a public service announcement or public service thing to keep in mind. And that is that we are, God willing, hoping to restart our Tuesday night Partners in Torah program in the coming weeks. We're working on details. The Federation is not quite ready to open back up to anybody yet, but there is another location we're working on at least for the summer, and then hopefully returning to the Federation in the fall. Now, when that happens, when we get that finalized and that happens, our plan is to move the Jewish Destiny series to Wednesday night. So just I wanted to throw that out there, and if there's any feedback on that from all of you, from our regulars, as to whether or not Wednesday works or it doesn't work, we would switch it to Wednesday at 8 o'clock so that we could reconvene our Tuesday night partners program. So just let me know offline in the chat box or at some point if you have some thoughts about this moving to Wednesday. But as of now, the plan would be that our pre-COVID Tuesday night program will start back up again in the coming weeks, and this program will move to Wednesday night. Okay, any feedback on that, please let me know. And excuse me. In the meantime, let's rock and roll and jump on in. Let me give you the outline for those of you who are interested in following along with the outline. It'll go into the chat box momentarily, and there it is. And let's rock and roll. Okay, so we left off 2 weeks ago talking about Isaac and Ishmael, Yitzchak and Yishmael, and the ongoing struggle, the ongoing relationship, if you will, that we have with our Muslim cousins, our Arab cousins, all one and the same. Again, we didn't talk too much about the rise of Islam. That'll be in a later series. But that was what we addressed last week or 2 weeks ago. And now tonight, the plan is to jump into our other relationship, because essentially we have two major relationships we have to deal with in the world. Because when we look at the world's population, you have on one hand 1 billion Muslims, and those are the descendants of Ishmael. And on the other hand, we have 1 billion Christians, and those we look at as the descendants of Esau. In other words, as we briefly introduced Esau last time, Esau goes by a bunch of different names in the Torah. Esau was seemingly his given name, but the nation that he founds is called Edom, which is the Hebrew word for Rome. So when we talk about Rome throughout antiquity and up into modern times, we are talking about Esau. We're talking about the nation of Esau. And along these lines, as we'll cover, that in the 4th century, Rome becomes Christian, and Christianity and Rome, or Rome and Christian, becomes synonymous. Now, that's painting a broad stroke. That's not 100% accurate, and we'll see that in later sessions. But in general, when we talk about Rome and the Christian world, it's all the nation of Esau. And it's what we're really delving into tonight. So if you think about world history and Jewish history and what we've gone through for the past 3,000 years, a lot of it has been negotiating our relationship with our cousins, negotiating our relationships with the descendants of Ishmael and the descendants of Esau. And from really understanding the nations at their core, from a Torah sense, we get that concept that we've been talking about of Maisa Avos Sim and the Banim, of the actions of our forefathers are a harbinger for all future generations, and we can come to a certain understanding of what we are dealing with. So that's what we will that's what we're really talking about tonight. By the way, someone just messaged me privately. It's actually about 2 billion Christians now, and I would guess probably about 2 billion Muslims. Basically, we have a situation where a third of the world is Islam and a third of the world is Muslim, and a third of the world is Christian, roughly. painting broad strokes. So tonight we're delving into the nation of Esau, Edom, Rome, the Christian world. That's what we're talking about when we talk about our relationship with Esau. So Esau, until roughly the age of 13, Jacob and Esau live parallel lives as twins. There's little distinction between the two. There's little reason to believe that they're not going to form a partnership. And that's the original goal, as we understand it from the philosophical writings, that when Isaac and Rebekah have two twin sons, their plan, so to speak, for the progeny of Abraham is that the nation be led by the two of them, and that there will be certain jobs that Esau will have and certain jobs that Yaakov will have, and together they will form a partnership. Now, the way that I like to understand and explain this relationship that was planned out and that we'll see played out in a different way comes from the words of King David in Psalms. King David in Psalms, and this is a very famous psalm. It's one of the ones we say in the Pesukei D'Zimra section of the Shabbos morning davening. We say the words Sur Meira ve'aseh tov Bake Shalom v'radfehu, which means Sur Meira means to remove evil, Aseh Tov means to do good, Bake Shalom v'radfehu, request or wish for peace and run after it. So King David in this verse is giving us essentially a prescription, is giving us a blueprint for how we deal with society. That when we're trying to improve a society and really prepare a society for ourselves or prepare a community or a culture or a situation, that's what we have to do. The first thing we have to do is sur meira. We have to remove the evil. We have to remove the negativity. We have to get the negativity out. Once that's done, aseh tov, at that point, we can instill the good. And so to speak, that was the plan for Jacob and Esau. In other words, Rebekah and Isaac both knew equally that Jacob and Esau had different tendencies, had different character traits. The Torah tells us that Esau was the hunter, the warrior, and Jacob was Ish Tam Yoshev Olim. He was the simple one who sat in the tents. That was known to both their parents. Okay, as we delve into the famous story of the blessings and the stealing of the blessings, it's important to know both Isaac and Rebekah knew clearly the tendencies, the character traits, the desires of their two boys. It's a question of how they process that. In other words, they both knew that Esau had a tendency towards evil. They both knew that Jacob had a tendency towards good. Now, what Isaac thought, so to speak, that would play out as is Esau would be the Sur Meira. In other words, Esau's job throughout history would be to remove the evil. He would be the warrior. He would go in. He would fight. He would knock out all the evil. And then Jacob would be the Aseh Tov. He would come in and he would instill open up the synagogues and the yeshivas after Esau had removed all the evil. That is seemingly how Isaac thought things would play out. Now, as we all know, mothers know best, wives know best, and Isaac had it all wrong in this situation. Now, what happened is told to us from our sages, from the homiletic topics of the Torah, from the Midrashim. We're told that Esau, even though that he had this tendency towards evil, and the evil essentially overcame him, right? There's a statement of the prophet Isaiah, I believe, who says "V'yochu acharei hahevel v'yahabolu," that you ran after emptiness and you became empty. The concept being that whatever people run after, whatever people desire, and whatever people work towards, that's what they become. So Esau and his desire towards evil, as opposed to being the conqueror of evil, he got pulled in by the evil and became evil, but the whole time worked tirelessly to not let his parents know. In other words, whatever negative activities he did, whatever negative actions he perpetrated, he worked tirelessly to hide them from his parents. Now, our sages tell us that women have what's called a bina yasera, have an extra level of understanding above men. Again, anyone who's married knows that, and therefore Rebekah, the mother, had a more innate understanding of her boys, and she knew that Esau had essentially become a charlatan. She understood it, And Isaac didn't. And we shouldn't think for a moment that they didn't have a husband-wife relationship where they talked about their children and the future of their children. You know, we can almost paint the picture, if you will, I'm using a little bit of poetic license here, of Rebecca and Isaac having conversations about their two boys, and Rebecca trying to convince Isaac that Esau had, as we would say nowadays, gone off the derech, right? He'd gone off the path, that he had gone towards evil, and that he could not be one of the progenitors of the family of Abraham. And Isaac will respond, honey, what are you talking about? I'm a prophet. I'm the son of Abraham. I survived the binding of Isaac. I mean, they call it after my name, for crying out loud. Like, you can't fool me. You think that our son is pulling the wool over my eyes? You can't pull the wool over the eyes of a prophet. I'm sorry. I don't believe you, honey. I don't believe he's fooling me. I think I know what he's all about. I think he's sincere. I think I have a better understanding here than you do. And that seemingly was the struggle between Rebecca and Isaac. The Rebecca had an understanding of where Esau had fallen to, whereas Isaac was being fooled by Esau. And the sages tell us that Esau would do this by trying to represent himself to his father as a very pious, not a Jew because there weren't Jews yet, but a very pious person. He would ask him all kinds of questions about monotheistic things. One of the things our sages tell us is that he asked his father a question if you have to tithe salt and things like that. And all the time it left Isaac believing his son was still righteous. Now, when we get to the end of the story, so to speak, it's time for Isaac to give the final blessings to his children. Now, what does that mean? It's essentially time for him to pass the baton, pass the mantle of leadership, pass the scepter, if you will, and he is planning to do that to Esau. Rebecca finds out and she says, if not now, when? Im lo achshav emasai, as we say in Pirkei Avos. And she knew she had to act because she knew if the scepter was to be passed on to Esau, that would be the end of the Jewish people before they ever have a chance to begin. So in a last-ditch effort, she said, how am I going to convince my husband now before it's too late? So the wise woman sits back and she says, okay, so all these days, weeks, months, years, Esau has been fooling Isaac to make him think that Esau is righteous. So I have to prove to Isaac that it, in fact, is possible to fool a prophet, and it is possible to fool the son of Abraham, and it is possible to fool the one who survived the binding of Isaac. I had to prove to him such a thing as possible. So how am I going to show him that all along Esau has been fooling him as to who his true identity is? I know. I'm going to have Yaakov, Jacob, fool Isaac as to who his true identity is in order to prove my point. So she calls him Jacob and she says, honey, we have to do something here. Your father is about to pass the mantle of leadership on to Esau. You and I both know that that is not a good thing. And nothing I have been able to do until this point has been able to convince him otherwise. So here's my plan. Here's how we're gonna work this out. I'm going to dress you up as Esau, and we're going to basically fool dad. We're going to make him think you're Esau. And in so doing, you're going to get the mantle of leadership, the blessing, so to speak. The scepter's going to be handed to you, and we're all good. Now let's see how this plays out, because again, I'm sure you have a lot of questions as to, okay, practically, how's that turn out if Isaac thinks he's passing the blessing on to Esau, but it's really Jacob? How does it take hold? If he's fooled, how's all that happen? Hold your horses, and we're going to see. So Rebecca goes through the whole process. She gives Jacob the clothing of Esau. She prepares the meal for him and has Jacob take the meal in. Now, the whole time when Jacob is, so to speak, identifying himself, he never lies. We refer to Yaakov as his trait, his midah is emes, is truth. And that is constantly challenged. Here's the first time it's challenged. We'll see this challenged even more when he has to deal with his wonderful father-in-law, Laban. But so even when he has these challenging situations where the truth of reality is being challenged, he's very careful with his words. That's how we understand this from the Torah. And even when he walks in, now I failed to mention that at this point Isaac is blind. Okay, Isaac is legally blind. Not only legally blind, but blind, right? He's completely blind. And our sages have a few ideas as to why he's blind. But one of the at a simple level, we can understand it that he had to be blind for this situation to play out, right? Because if he had sight, it would have never happened. So Isaac is blind. Being as Jacob and Esau were twins, there's enough about the properties, their voices, or whatever it was that were similar that such a situation could play out. And we see, like I said, that Yaakov is very careful to not reveal who he is, while at the same time not directly lying. Like we see that when Jacob goes into Isaac, he says, sorry. My wife always tells me I have to have all the verses I want to quote marked beforehand because I waste too much time looking for them. So I apologize. I'm sitting here opening the Chumash trying to get the right verse here. So anyhow, so when Jacob goes in, Isaac says, "Who's there?" And Jacob's response, I'll read the verse in Hebrew and translate. It says, "V'yomer Yaakov el Aviv," that Jacob says to his father, "Anochi Esav bechorecha." And that seems to be a straight out lie. But as we know, the Torah has no punctuation in it. So it depends on where you put the comma. So one of the things our sages say is that what Jacob said was, he says to his father, Anochi, meaning it's me, comma, Esav b'chorecha, but Esav is your firstborn, right? That's one of the ways our sages point out that could be that Jacob was trying to really try not to lie more than he had to pull this out. Anyway, he goes through the situation. He brings the food, and Isaac's suspicious. Because there's certain ways that this person in front of him is talking that makes him think it's Jacob. And he says, "Can you come close?" He feels them. Okay, Rebecca planned for this. She put certain things on his arms to make him feel hairy because Esau was hairier than Jacob. And Isaac responds with the fateful words of Kol Kol Yaakov v'yadayim yadei Esau, that the voice is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau. Meaning their voice was genetically the same, but he means the words that were being said sounded more like Jacob's words than Esau's words. But here's what we have to understand here. And this is the key thing. If Isaac seemed to be suspect that something was up, why does Isaac go through with it? Because, again, playing back to the prophet role, whatever spiritual necessity Isaac had to feel at that moment, he felt. In other words, that he might have had his practical suspicion in a physical sense, but spiritually, he understood that what he was about to do was the right thing. So he goes forth and he gives Jacob the blessing, meaning he passes the role of leadership onto Jacob. Jacob leaves, in walks Esau, and Isaac says, "Who's here now?" And Esau responds, "What do you mean, Dad? It's me, Esau. You told me to go bring your food, get the blessing." And then Isaac says, and again, very, very, very interesting words. If you look at these specific words of the Chumash, it says over here that after Esau reveals himself, right then Isaac figured it all out, so to speak. In other words, he knows that if this is Esau, then the one before had to be Jacob, and the blessing went to Jacob. But really, going back to what we said before, he finally realizes what every man realizes at some point in his life, that his wife is right. Right? As they say, behind every great man, there's a woman shaking her head. And Isaac finally realized that my wife was right, because I kept saying you can't fool a prophet. And here, Jacob fooled me into thinking he was Esau. But let's look at the words that he says in response. It says, when Isaac realizes what's going on, it says, V'yecherad Yitzchak charada gedola, which means Isaac trembled when he realized what happened. And Rashi says that, what does that mean? It says they saw the pit of hell opening underneath him. In other words, he saw the grave mistake that he had almost made. and he says, "V'yomer mi efa hu hatzar tzad." Who was that who just came in, fixed me that meal? V'yavei lo v'ocho, and he brought to me and I ate. Mikol b'tam tavo. I ate all some. V'avarchehu, and I gave him the blessing. Gam baruch yiyeh. He should be blessed. Now, again, put yourself in the situation of Isaac. Your son and your wife have just duped you. They played a major. You can't even call this a prank. This is like a major coup d'état over here that they perpetrated against you. That you had certain plans for your family that's becoming a nation. They just stole the entire estate, gave it from the son you intended to give it to your other son. And what does he say? The one who got it, he should be blessed. In other words, I was wrong. Esau was never supposed to get this. Jacob was supposed to get this. Rebecca was right all along. Gam baruch yeh. And we see in a moment, after the story plays out, I'll wait till we get there, but I wanted to say how, show how Esau helps things out over here. When Esau heard what happened, he cried out a tremendous scream, and a terrible, terrible scream. But Avi said, "You got to have one blessing left for me." And then he said, and then he plays right into it. He says, that my brother fooled me, and he took my blessing, and he says, Yaakov, this is why we call him Jacob, because this is now the second time that he's stolen my blessing / birthright, right? Because we had the story we talked about before, how when Esau came in and wanted lentil soup, he sold it for the birthright. So Isaac says to him, what are you talking about the second time, right? Oh, you mean you sold your birthright to Jacob? Again, that's a physical transaction. That means that you financially sold it. So, okay, Esau, thank you. I see what's going on over here. Jacob's first chair, your second chair. That's what's going on from now on. You want to be part of the team, that's fine. But you can only be part of the team under your brother as the head of the family and the head of the eventual nation. I finally get what's going on over here. And he does give Esau a blessing. And it's a very important blessing to keep in mind. What's the blessing he gives him? In Gashmias and physicality and the wealth, so to speak, the wealth part of blessing, it's almost the same, right? He gives Jacob and Esau essentially the same blessing, that they should have tremendous wealth and build great nations. But he says clearly that Jacob is going to be on top. Jacob's going to be the head. But he makes a clause. He says, though, if Jacob's ever not behaving properly and not doing what I expect of him, then you can rule. But as long as he's doing the right thing, he's in charge. Now, let's take a step back for a moment and go macro. If we look at world history for the past, what year are we talking about over here? Roughly like 1530 before the Common Era, so roughly 3,500 years. If we look at the past 3,500 years, who's benefited more from these blessings, right? In other words, the blessing was that Jacob's on top. He's going to be the head. But anytime he's not doing what he's supposed to, Esau, you can rule. Now, let's face it, for a lot of these 3,500 years of world history since that point, Esau's been in charge, right? Esau's been in charge. And we had a few moments on top, as we'll talk about, but Esau's been much more on top than us. And the simple answer to that point is, okay, you're right. That's how it's been for the past 3 millennium or whatever it is. But that's not all of world history, right? That's not the whole story. That's not the whole story hasn't been written yet. And yeah, so he's gotten 3,000 years where mostly he's been on top. Fine. Or really, I'd say 2,000 years where he's been mostly on top. Fine. But that's only one part of the story. The story is yet to be completed. Now, Esau at this point vows to kill Jacob, because if he's playing second chair, the best, quickest, easiest way to get back into first chair is kill your brother, right? So he says, okay, I have a simple plan over here. I'm just going to kill Jacob, and then I'll be back on top. Now, Isaac and Rebecca are worried about that. They know that's a possibility, so they send Jacob away. Now, before they send Jacob away, Isaac calls him Jacob and reiterates the blessing. So now we have 3 I guess, pieces of the puzzle to show how there's no stealing over here. There's a process over here that needed to happen in order for things to play out. Number one is when Isaac bestows the crown, so to speak, onto Jacob. Spiritually, he feels that it's the right thing to do. Otherwise, it wouldn't have happened. Number two, after he realizes what played out, he says, Gam Baruch Yeh, Jacob gets a blessing. Right? I'm not taking back the crown. That was the right thing to do. I see it now. And number three, before he sends Jacob away to protect him from Esau, he brings him in once again and reiterates essentially a third time that the birthright, the blessing, goes to Jacob and not to Esau. Okay, that's where the struggle starts. So when we look at how this is played out, there's a concept that the Talmud talks about of Esav Sonei es Yaakov, that Esav hates Jacob. In other words, Edom, Rome, hates the Jews, right? Or as I think it's the Tom Lehrer song, how the rich folk hate the poor folk, and this one hates that one, but everyone hates the Jews, right? So that starts here. In other words, if we want to look at the real roots of anti-Semitism, which is a big issue nowadays, let's face it, it's rearing its ugly face once again in history, a lot of it starts here. A lot of it starts here. A lot of it started last week too, with that other 1 billion or 2 billion people of the world. But a lot of it is also here in the struggle between Esav and Jacob, that Esav hates Yaakov. Now, we'll talk about, there are going to be certain times in history where our relationship will be closer than other points. Right now, for example, is one time period where even though we have some struggles going on in the world right now, the relationship, so to speak, between Esav and Jacob is a fairly benevolent one. I mean, let's face it, it is. It's just the reality of the world. You have you have American support for Israel for now. Hopefully, it should stay. You have a lot of Christian support for Israel. There's a lot of skepticism with the Southern Baptists and evangelicals supporting Israel. I have no problem with that. And someone will say to me, but what do you mean? They're just doing it so they think Jesus will come back? So they'll be wrong when they figure it out at the end of the day. It's no big deal, right? As I say when I've spoken to Christian groups, that when the Messiah gets here, we're just going to ask him, is this your first time or your second time, right? And that'll be fun. It doesn't worry me. Again, other people it does worry. I don't want to poo-poo those who are concerned about that. But bottom line is we have a fairly benevolent relationship with Edom, Esau, the Christian world, which is represented again by America, by Christianity in general. We have a great relationship right now. There's been other times in history where we've had a great relationship, and we'll touch on those. There's been some dark days too that we'll touch on. But this is where it all starts. This is the core of the struggle. This is the core of the relationship. And this is what happens at the beginning. Okay, I'm going to take a quick pause for questions before we continue. I know that if you're following the outline, we haven't covered that much in the outline yet, but there's a lot more words in the outline. But that was the very important foundation to understand this. Okay, a few notes here. So I mentioned the 2 billion Christians. Someone had some feedback about when to reschedule the class. Get the negativity out yet to find the, okay. So Ron asked a question that going back to the concept we said of Sur Meira, of Esav's job seemingly was supposed to be to remove negativity, remove evil. So I can give that as an example that we see that when, well, you know what, actually, Ron, I'm gonna ask you to hold up on that because it'll play out in something we're gonna discuss next. So I'm gonna hold off on your question, and afterwards, if it's still there, let me know. But any other questions at this point on anything that we've said or anything we're gonna say, you can either unmute yourself or put in the chat box, whatever works for you. Okay, so we shall continue. And if you have any questions as we go on, by all means, please either put them in the chat box or jot them down. And then at the end, we'll once again have plenty of time for questions. So continuing right along. Okay, so Jacob flees from his family's house, and his mother sends him back to Haran, which is where they come from. And she says that while you're away, go back to my brother's house, the house of Lavan, and get married, right? Marry one of his girls. That's essentially what she says. Now, what we talked about before, and I want to bring back up that the family tree for anyone who might not have it from before, that that the process of beginning the Jewish people is a many-year process, many-generation process, and a lot of it has to deal with filtering out, so to speak, the family of Terach. Terach was Abraham's father, and we see that the beginning of the Jewish people, a lot of it is not just Abraham, but it's going back to the family of Terach and pulling out certain points of it. So I'm putting in the chat box now the family tree that we gave out a couple sessions ago, for anyone who wants to take a look at it. So if you're looking at the family tree, going back to, you have it there in Hebrew and in English. So Terach is at top. We have on the right side, we have Abraham who marries Sarah. They have Isaac. Isaac marries Rivka or Rebecca. Rebecca, again, is part of the family. See where she fits into the family. She's the daughter of Bethuel, the granddaughter of Nahor, who was the brother of Abraham. And now we're going to her brother, Lavan, and that's where Jacob's wives are going to come from. Okay, so Rebecca says, okay, while you're gone, get married, find a nice girl from our family, and continue this process of so to speak, taking out what we need to from the family of Terach so that we can form the Jewish people. So that's what he does. He goes to his uncle's house with the intention of marrying one of his daughters. Now, our sages tell us and this is when the years are added up, that there's 14 years missing. It takes him 14 years to get from basically Israel to Iraq. Right? Now, it doesn't take that long. Even if you are walking by foot or by camel, it doesn't take 14 years. Our sages tell us that in the meantime, he spent 14 years at the yeshiva of Aver. Now, what is the yeshiva of Aver? We mentioned before these two famous monotheists who existed in between Noah and Abraham, their names being Shem and Aver. Shem was actually the son of Noah, and Aver was his great-grandson. I forget how many greats there are. And they had an academy of monotheism that they, even before Abraham, and they attempted to teach monotheism to the world. And we see there were certain interactions between this academy and our matriarchs and patriarchs. Now, this essentially all comes to us from the homiletics and the Talmud and the Midrashim. But that's what we're told, that Jacob spends 14 years fortifying himself spiritually before he goes on to Laban. In other words, he understood at this point that his life was going to be a life of a certain amount of challenges. He understood that on one hand, he was going to have the eternal challenge with his brother Esau. And now he's being sent to the house of Laban, and he knows that's going to have another whole slew of challenges. So therefore, he wants to fortify himself spiritually. So he spends 14 years preparing for going to the house of Laban, of Lavan. That's what we understand it from our sages. Okay? Now, when Jacob finally, 14 years later, arrives in Haran, one of the first incidents we're told about is he actually meets his cousin, or to-be wife, Rachel / Rachel. And right away, again, because of his spiritual genes, his spiritual innateness, he understands that this is his beshert. And he goes over, and the Torah tells us he kisses her, and he gives her presents and all these things, and he finds out, sure enough, this is his cousin. This is actually, he knew beforehand, because the village people, not the band, I mean the people who lived in the village, they said that he had inquired about Laban. They said that's his daughter coming. So right away he knows this is his beshert. So he has Rachel take him to her father's house, to Laban's house, and Lavan says, yeah, might as well marry her off to you. You're better than anyone else. But, we don't just give our daughters away here. You got to work for her. So work for me for 7 years. And then after those 7 years, you can marry my daughter. You can marry my daughter. Fine. So Jacob works for 7 years, and it comes time for the big wedding. And Laban, being our sages refer to him as Lavan Haramai, which means Laban the trickster. So being in other words, the shady character, right? The one of shady character. So being the shady guy that he was, he pulls shtick on Jacob and switches Leah under the chuppah, or whatever they had, at that point, under the chuppah for Rachel. She had a veil over her face. It was nighttime, not enough lights, whatever it was. According to some opinions, Rachel and Leah were twins, just like Jacob and Esau. And how this happened practically, and Jacob didn't know till the morning. a lot of discussion on it, but be it as it may, the trickery was pulled off. In the morning, Jacob, only in the morning after the wedding, after the marriage had been consummated, so to speak, he realizes what happened. He goes back to his father-in-law and he says, "What did you do to me? I wanted Rachel. You gave me Leah." And to which Lavan responds, "Well, I don't know how you do it over in Beersheba where you live, but here in Haran, we never give the younger before the older, and therefore I gave you Leah. And if you want to marry Rachel, you can have her too, but you got to work another 7 years. So then you can have her too." Fine. So Jacob waits 7 days and then marries Rachel and works another 7 years to, so to speak, pay off his debt for Rachel. Again, that's a little confusing, the verses, but that's how it plays out. So the time period is he comes to Laban, works for the first 7 years, gets tricked into marrying Leah, waits 7 days, marries Rachel, and then has to work for the next 7 years to pay off his debt to his father-in-law. After that point, he works an additional 7 years for himself. In other words, he makes a deal with his father-in-law. They should actually be compensated for his work, and he builds his own estate at that point. Now, a couple things here. Number one, we understand that at the time that he marries Rachel and Leah, or Leah and Rachel, if we go in chronological order, that he marries 2 other women as well. He marries Bilhah and Zilpah. Bilhah and Zilpah, a lot of times we refer to them as the maidservants, the handmaids, but it's a little bit different than that, actually. That if we look at what Rashi says, Rashi in his brevity says they were the Benos Pelagshim, which means the daughters of concubines, which means what? That they were not necessarily handmaids or servants, or they were sisters. They were half sisters to Rachel and Leah, but they had the same father. They were fathered by Laban, and that's why, again, if you go back to the family tree, it shows them coming from Lavan. But they were not from, so to speak, a full wife. They were from a concubine. Again, what that meant to Laban, not quite sure. Why they had different status is a little unclear, but Rashi says that this is Rashi's way of saying that they were all sisters. All 4 of them are sisters, just Rachel and Leah are full children, if you will, of Lavan, and Bilhah and Zilpah are from concubines, from not a full wife, from not a full part of the family. So, and through this process, they also marry Jacob. A little hard to understand. I have to admit, this is one of those areas in the Chumash that I've, still have a lot of work to do to have a full understanding on why, how the 2 extra wives play in, so to speak, why it was necessary, so to speak, to build the Jewish people with 4, matriarchs at this point, as opposed to just 2, and why, even though we're going to see that Bilhah and Zilpah are mothers to the tribes, that they don't fully reach the status of what we call a matriarch. Again, I got some work to do. Hopefully I'll achieve it one of these days and be able to give you a better understanding. But be it as it may, these are the 4 mothers and the 1 father of the Jewish people. Now, let me try and explain. Now that I gave you the so to speak, the soap opera, let me try and give you the my understanding of the soap opera, because let's face it, this is a great soap opera at this point. I'll give you the last little bit of the soap opera, and then we'll do some explanation. So the next step, so to speak, of how this plays out is Leah, so to speak, the wife that wasn't really wanted, but okay, she's still part of the family. Leah is prolific, right? She has many children. She right away has Reuven, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda. We understand that she has 4 children right off the bat, or I guess, a year apart or whatever it is. But the first number of years of the marriage, of the dual marriage, we see that Reuven, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda are born. And the whole time, Rachel is barren. Rachel does not have children. So at that point, Rachel says, okay, I'm clearly barren. I'm not having children, but I'm going to give my handmaid, Bilhah, or my half sister, or whatever it is, I'm going to give her over to Jacob now, and she'll have the children for me, and I'll raise the children. They'll be like mine. Okay. So Jacob with Bilhah has 2 more children, Dan and Naphtali. and at which point Leah says, oh, well, if she's giving over a handmaid, I should do the same thing. And she gives over Zilpah. And from Zilpah, Jacob has two more children. That's Gad and Asher. Again, if you're following the outline, I put numbers next to all of them so you could see the birth order. So we're up to number 8 now. Asher's number 8 from Zilpah. And then Leah has two more children, Zevulun, and has 3 more children, Yisachar, Zevulun, and Dinah. Okay? So all in all, the Torah tells us of 6 children born to Leah, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Yisachar, Zevulun, and Dinah. 2 then born to Bilhah, Dan and Naphtali, 2 born to Zilpah, Gad and Asher. And then finally, after all this, Rachel becomes pregnant. She becomes pregnant first with Yosef, who's now the 12th child, and eventually to Benjamin. Okay. Now that's sort of our whole soap opera, at least the events of the soap opera. Let me try and give some philosophy behind it, so hopefully come to some understanding of what in the world is going on here. You know, it's funny that my Rosh Hashiva, Shmuel Yaakov Weinberg, used to say that that the Torah is either completely divine, completely min hashamayim, completely from the Almighty, completely from Hashem, or it was written by the world's biggest anti-Semite, because it does not hide any of our any of our family secrets. It puts it all out there for us, and that's definitely what's going on in this discussion we're having tonight. And it, so I mean, just play it out. You have younger brother stealing the birthright from the older brother threatening to kill the younger brother runs away to marry his first cousin, and wants to marry one cousin, is tricked to marry the other one, but marries the other one too, and has a whole family of 13 kids. Great soap opera. What's going on over here? Our sages tell us that in the original plan, so to speak, there was an understanding that Lavan was the father-in-law of what would become the Jewish people. In other words, there's a concept that was known to the prophetic family of Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob, Esau, that their wives are going to come from the family of Lavan. Now, what people would say on the street, so to speak, was, oh, Leah is the older one. She's going to marry Esau. Rachel's the younger one. She's going to marry Jacob, right? Because Esau was the oldest marries oldest, younger marries younger. Okay? There's only one problem. By the time we get to the weddings, Esau's out of the picture. Not out of the picture because we're going to deal with him throughout history, but out of the picture of forming the Jewish people. So what happens when Esau is off of Team Abraham? So as we mentioned before, that the plan, so to speak, of Isaac and Rebekah was that there'd be a partnership between Jacob and Esau. That Esau would be the Sur Meirah, the one who would go and conquer evil, fight evil, destroy the evil, and then Jacob would be the Aseh Tov. Jacob would bring in the good once the evil was destroyed. But now that Esau, so to speak, is out of the picture, who's going to do that job? Well, now Jacob has to do the job of both. He has to do the job of being the Yaakov and the Esau, because Esau's out of there. So now Jacob, one person, has to be both the Sur Meirah, the one who will fight evil and remove evil, and the Aseh Tov, the one who will do good. But it's interesting, because as we see it play out throughout world history, and we'll go macro for a moment here, as we see it play out throughout Jewish history, we see that specifically, it's the children of Rachel who will fight the evil and destroy the evil, and it will be the children of specifically, and we'll see why more next week, the children of Yehuda from Leah who go in to instill the good afterwards. So, if you will, the Esau job ends up with the children of Rachel, and the Yaakov job ends up with the children that descend from Judah, from Leah. Now, practically, so again, with the Hebrew terms, the Sur Meirah, the removers of evil, are going to be the children of Rachel, and the house of Judah will be the ones who will do good. Now, Ron asked a question before. What do I mean by removing evil, by fighting negativity? Here's how it's played out throughout history as we see it. Now, let me take one just half a step back here. We see there's certain similarities between Rachel and Esau. In other words, that here Esau was the warrior, the one who was supposed to go out and fight. We see that Rachel is referred to as the Yefet Toar. She was the one who was prettier. We see that in a moment she's going to try and destroy her father's idols. We see there's this sort of like same natia, as we would say, same character trait of wanting to destroy the evil. Whereas Leah, we see as more of we see that she names her first kid Yehuda, which means give thanks to Hashem. She's more of the praying type, the spiritual type. So that's one reason how we see those character traits play down, and why the children of Rachel become the removers of evil, and the children of Leah, specifically Judah, become the doers of good. Now, I have a teacher, we had him in the 10-step series, Rabbi Orlovsky, who has a creative idea that I'm not going to go too much into, but that really, that Rachel was supposed to be Esau's wife and Leah was supposed to be Jacob's wife. Okay, I don't want to get into that because pretty much many of the other commentators don't say like that. But be it as it may, this is what we do see play out throughout history. And let me explain to you how. We're going macro. So when the Jews go down to Egypt shortly, next week, who's going to be the first one to descend to prepare the way for the Jews? It's going to be Yosef from Rachel. And who's going to be the next one to come in representing Jacob? It's going to be Judah. And Rashi tells us that he goes first to set up the spiritualness that they needed in Goshen. Okay? Fast forward to when the Jews get to Israel and it comes time to prepare for the monarchy of the Jewish people. Who is the one who sets the stage for the monarchy of the Jewish people? It's Saul, King Saul from Benjamin, from Rachel. And who's the one who establishes the eternal monarchy? It's David from Judah. Fast forward to after the destruction of the first temple, and it becomes time to go back for the second temple. Who's the one who fights off the evil obstacles at the time right before the building of the second temple? It is none other than Mordechai and Esther. Where do Mordechai and Esther come from? They come from the tribe of Benjamin, again, from Rachel. And who's the one who goes back to build the second temple? A man by the name of Zerubbabel, who is a descendant of King David from Judah, okay? And fast forward to hopefully the Messianic era, which we should all be privileged to see. There's a concept that's talked about heavily in Kabbalistic writings that when the Messianic era has arrived, that the wars of Hashem, so to speak, will be fought by a term that is used in Kabbalistic literature of Mashiach ben Yosef, which basically means the king from the house of Joseph. And he'll fight the wars, in other words, remove the evil. And then afterwards, the Davidic dynasty will be reinstituted by Mashiach ben David, which means the Messiah, the king from the house of David, playing out this process throughout history of first removing the evil through the children of Rachel, and then instilling the good through specifically the line of Judah. Now, one other macro, again, the actions of our forefathers being a harbinger for future generations, idea that we see throughout world history along these lines is that every time throughout world history that we are ready to, so to speak, flex the muscles of our birthright, flex that blessing that Jacob got from Isaac and show that we're really the ones on top, Esau is always going to be there to stop us. First of all, we see here that Esau tried to stop us, right? That's what we see. This is the original Esau happened right here. But as we fast forward through time, after the Jews leave Egypt, who is, so to speak, the first person we encounter after leaving Egypt? Amalek, the grandson of Esau, and really the one who represents all the hatred of Esau throughout world history. Amalek comes to attack the Jewish people after leaving Egypt and preparing to go into the land of Israel. Eventually, the Jews get to the land of Israel and they build that monarchy, starting with King Saul. What happens right at the beginning of Saul's reign? Again, Amalek attacks. The house of Esau comes to attack. And there's wars with Saul and there's wars with David, with Amalek. And again, fast forwarding to the destruction of the first temple, right before they're going back to build the second temple, who rears his ugly face to try and wipe out the Jewish people? None other than Haman, who was an Agagite from Amalek. He's an Amaleki from Esau, right there trying to stop the Jewish people from going into the land of Israel. And here's the big if you needed a mic drop or a jaw drop, I'm going to give it to you now, hopefully. And that is, we now see that after 2,000 years, we've returned to the land of Israel. We have, I talk about this often, that we have the majority of the world Jewish population living in the land of Israel. Again, we have our challenges, as we all know, but we still, all of us are seeing things that Jews haven't seen for 2,500 years. And for those of us who, I don't know if anyone here is old enough to remember 1948, I don't know if anyone here was even born in 1948, but the ecstasy of the state of Israel being founded and the just uncanny events that had to unfold for that to happen. We'll get there in many months with this series, but we're living in amazing times. But again, what happened right before? What happened right before the Jews en masse return to the land of Israel? So I want to read you something from the Talmud. This is in the Tractate Megillah, page 6b. It says over here that Germania shall Edom, that there's a division, if you will, of the nation of Edom. Again, remember, Edom, Rome, Esau, the Christian world, all one and the same in rabbinic literature. So there's a subdivision of the nation of Edom, of Esau's nation, called Germania. That should sound a little bit familiar to us, right? As it's translated in English, Germany. Okay? Shilole hein yotzim mecharvin kol ha'olam kulo. If they would be able to go forth, or I'll use poetic license, get their act together, they would destroy the whole entire world. Now, the Talmud goes on. Why can't they get their act together? Says Rabbi Chama Bar Chanina, he says, within this Germany subdivision of Esau, there are 300 princes, each with a crown, and they go out and fight each other every day. And every day one is killed, and they spend their time appointing a new king, and like they're too busy bickering amongst themselves. That's essentially what the Talmud says. If they would ever stop bickering amongst themselves and essentially unite, then the world's in trouble. What happened in the late 19th century? They finally united, right? If we do a quick German history, you have Hitler, Yamach Shemo, referred to his empire that he was trying to build for 1,000 years, lasted, thank God, only 12, which was 12 too long. He referred to as the Third Reich, which means the Third Empire. What were the first two? Number one was the Empire of Charlemagne, aka the Holy Roman Empire, which was neither holy nor was it Roman. We'll get to that later. That was the first Reich, the first empire. The second one was the German Empire that was started by eventually, basically Kaiser Wilhelm I. That was the second empire, which was when the German city-states, which at that point Germany, the Kingdom of Germany was maybe 30 or 40 loosely united city-states. It was called the German Confederacy. Kaiser Wilhelm is able to unite it all together, make it into one empire. He almost destroys the entire world in process. Thank God doesn't. But then comes along Hitler, Yamach Shemo, from Germany of Edom. And again, almost destroys the entire world. And when we talk about that many months from now, we'll see that what was his goal? It's clear in his literature. World War II was lost 1943, 1942, like by any military expert, they'll tell you the war was over for sure by 1944. It's over. Germany has no chance. But what does he then become fanatical in? That is the final solution, right? The Holocaust, the extermination of European Jewry. Because from that point on, his goal was to wipe out every single Jew. And that's why in that last year, when it was clear that Germany had lost, it's just a matter of it playing out, so to speak. It wasn't. I don't want to say it was so clear. There's, I'm painting broad strokes here. There were different last-ditch efforts they made that could have gone in different directions, but it was pretty clear with hindsight what was happening. And in that last year, that's when the greatest majority of the 6 million wiped out in the Holocaust were wiped out, because Hitler was out to destroy the Jewish people. Because if we take this idea from the Talmud, we see that not only is it just association when we refer to Hitler and the Germans as part of Amalek. We see it in character that they're right there as part of Amalek. And that's why, by the way, when you go to, I was never in the old Yad Vashem, I was only in the new Yad Vashem. But one of the last things you see in the new Yad Vashem is the last room. There's a big banner hanging that says in Hebrew, Timcha ez zecher Amalek mitachas hashemayim, which means wipe out the memory of Amalek from under heaven, because that's the idea. That not only do we say just by association that Hitler and the Germans and the Nazis were part of Amalek, we have reason to believe that in their genes, in their DNA, they're very much a part of Esav and Amalek. And they were trying to do this job that Amalek always does, and that is stop the Jewish people when they are trying to lay their claim as the progenitors of Isaac, as the progenitors of the people, as the nation of Abraham, that he's always there to try and stop us. Okay, just a few more points, and then we'll wrap up and open the floor to questions. That after Jacob builds his family, all 12 of his children, he builds his own wealth through a whole process the Torah describes of Lavan is constantly trying to be the shady character and not let him build his wealth. Jacob, God helps him. He finds a way. He builds his wealth. Finally, Jacob says, it's time to go. It's time to get out of here. And it's after Joseph's born. And the prophet Hosea tells us that Esau is like a pile of straw, and Yosef is that flame that's going to burn up the pile of straw into nothing. Again, with that idea that we said before, that the descendants of Rachel are going to be the ones who will burn up Esau. So Jacob knew spiritually, once Joseph was born, once he had progeny from Rachel, now he can go confront his brother Esau. And sure enough, he starts on his mission to confront Esau and to return to his father and to return with his family and start building the nation of Israel. And that will be a process we'll get into a little bit more next week. Now, on the way, Lavan tries to confront him, and they push Lavan away once again. And we do see a very sad event take place that before they make their way back to the house of Isaac, and that is that Rachel dies in childbirth with their second son, the second son from them, the son being Binyamin, and she is buried in the place where she passes away in Beis Lechem and Bethlehem. Bethlehem, by the way, if you've never heard of it, it's home of that very, 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 very famous Jew from world history. And of course, I'm referring to King David, right? King David's from Bethlehem too. Don't ever forget that. That's one of the reasons they made that association. But Rachel is buried in Bethlehem. Now we can ask the question as to why Rachel is buried in Bethlehem and Jacob doesn't take her to Hebron, to the cave of the patriarchs, where his grandfather were buried. If you know the map of Israel, you know that Hebron and Bethlehem are not that far apart. Bethlehem is about 30 miles due north of Hebron. Again, a lot of discussion on this. Why Leah's the one that's buried in the cave of the patriarchs, not Rachel. How one of Rachel's roles is to be there outside to cry for the Jewish people as they go into exile. Again, a lot of discussion about why. But be it as it may, when we talk about tombs in Israel, just as an aside, there's a lot of tombs in Israel, and a lot of them, there's a lot of question marks on, we'll just say, as to how authentic they are, as to if the person that the tour guides and really the Ministry of Tourism claims are buried there are really buried there. The story that I like to tell is the person who was on the trip to Israel, and the tour guide said that we're now going to visit the tomb of Samuel the prophet. And the person raised his hand and says, 1 second, on my last trip to Israel, our guide took us to the tomb of Samuel the prophet, and it was in a totally different place. To which the tour guide responded, yes, that was Samuel 1, this is Samuel 2. In the Bible, they call it Book of Samuel 1, Book of Samuel 2. Okay. But that's along those lines of a lot of question marks around tombs. That being said, the two tombs that we have the longest, most solid tradition on are Rachel's tomb in Bethlehem and the cave of the patriarchs in Hebron. And there's a very close Cleveland connection to the tomb of Rachel that we'll close up with before we open the floor to questions. And that is that the founder of Partners Cleveland, one of the founders, none other than Mendy Klein, Zichron Livracha, blessed memory, that one of his projects is that he visited his son and daughter who were living in Israel at the time, and they went to Rachel's tomb, and he was distraught by how broken down, how dirty the building was and the area was. And he basically took it upon himself to completely refurbish the structure around the tomb, to clean it up. It's actually fortified because, let's face it, Bethlehem isn't the safest place for Jews to go. There's a big wall, so Jews can get in there safely. And it's a beautiful building now there at Rachel's tomb. And just to show sort of the way that Mendy would function, as we said before, is when you go in there, it doesn't say dedicated by the family of Mendy and Ita Klein or Klein family. It doesn't say that almost anywhere. It says it in Hebrew on the curtain to the ark, but nowhere in English or in big plaques. It says dedicated by the Jewish Federation of Cleveland, because Mendy didn't want his name to be on it, so he did the whole thing through our Jewish Federation and gave the money for Rachel's tomb to be refurbished. So and just to show the crown jewel that is for us from Cleveland, that on one of my trips to Israel, I was up in Tzfat, which is total other end of the country. It's the north of Israel as opposed to Bethlehem's in the south. And I ran into one of my teacher's sons, actually the rabbi who married us, the officiating rabbi at our wedding. His son, I ran into him in Tzfat, and he said, "Oh, you're in Cleveland now. I was just at Rachel's tomb, and it said that the Federation of Cleveland did that whole refurbishing. How did that happen?" Because while I love the Federation movement, let's face it, federations usually don't go around, refurbishing ancient tombs in Israel. It's just not the projects they put their money into. But I told him, so to speak, the rest of the story of how really it was Mendy Klein, Zichron Livracha, and he didn't want to put his name on it, so he filtered the whole thing through the federation, and therefore now Cleveland's name is on the tomb of Rachel as the ones who refurbished it. Okay, so that brings us up to Jacob with the full family, now without his wife Rachel, but with all his children, now ready to confront his brother Esau. That's where we'll pick up next week, and then carry on with the next step in the building of the Jewish people. At this time, I want to, before we open up the floor to questions, I want to thank everyone for coming. I want to thank everyone for listening. Excuse me. Tune in next week as we'll continue this story and talk about the descent of the Jews to Egypt, the selling of Joseph into slavery, and other fun events like that. Thank you very much. And now on to questions. Let me see what's here in the chat box first. Again, if you have any questions, you can either put them in the chat box or feel free to momentarily unmute yourself after I get to everything in the chat box. So Ron asked a question, where was commentary about Germans written? So that's the Talmud, Tractate Megillah, page 6b, I believe it was, 6b, page 6b, Talmud Megillah. That's where that quote was that we said from the Talmud. Michaelis asks, what's the text of Germany, Princes Uniting, Tractate Talmud? Again, Megillah, Tractate Megillah, page 6b, right at the top of the page. What's the thought of whether David's tomb in Jerusalem is really his tomb? It's not, right? David's tomb is not in Jerusalem, especially because the Book of Kings tells us that all of the house of David was buried in what's called the City of David, which is not in today's old city of Jerusalem. We now know where the City of David is. It's called Ir David. You can go there now and look at the excavations. And while they haven't yet found the ancient tombs of the kings from the house of Judah, they found enough other stuff down there to make it pretty clear that was the City of David, what we refer to as Ir David, and not where they claim David's tomb is now. So that's one of those ones that's pretty much everyone says was not David's tomb. What's the significance of Jacob's name in terms of Israel? Okay, so we will get to this a little bit more next week, but just as a teaser, is we're going to see that the last step in Jacob taking on this role of being the progenitor of the nation, the Jewish people, is he's also given the national name. And the national name is Yisrael. And we'll see next week in the fighting of the angel how that came about. But every time we refer to the Jewish people as a nation, we're not Am Yaakov, right? We're not the nation of Jacob. We're Am Yisrael. We refer to this name of Yisrael because and the meaning of the name is Yashar Kel, straight with God, or the one who feared God, or the one who that was real with God. Those are the different ideas of the name Yisrael. But that's our national name, so to speak. It's Israel, Yisrael. So it's actually a funny story. Just as a parenthetical comment to Ron's question, is that when during the whole Second Commonwealth, the country is never called Israel. It's called Judah. We know that from Josephus. We know that from coins. We know that from everywhere. It's called Judah. And we're going to see that in a couple sessions. We're going to talk about the split of the kingdom and how it came to be. But definitely the Second Commonwealth, it's never called Israel, as far as we know. It was a question at the time of the founding of the modern state of Israel, what the name was going to be. And if you've ever read one of my favorite books, Prime Ministers by Yehuda Avner, he tells just a fascinating story about how he was in, I believe it was Tel Aviv, when the War for Independence broke out and the nation was declared and all that. And when they find out about it, first thing they found out is, we have a state. And the second question they ask is, what's it called, right? Because it wasn't clear until David Ben-Gurion reads the Declaration of Independence that the state was going to be called Israel and not be called Judah, or I think there might have been even some, I can't remember off the top of my head, there might have been some other considerations, but until that moment on the 5th of Iyar or May 14th, depending on what calendar you're using, right before Shabbos, it was a Friday afternoon, and David Ben-Gurion reads the Declaration of Independence, that was the unveiling of the name, because until that point, no one knew if it was going to be called Judah, Israel, or something else altogether. So that just plays into that name a little bit. Thank you for all the thank yous. And if there's any questions from the floor, again, you can still type in the chat box. But if anyone wants to unmute themselves and ask a question, by all means, ask away.
I can't tell anyone. No one can know that he's back. I can't believe you just lied to me.
Okay, so I guess we'll no questions. So feel free to reach out to me afterwards. My phone number and email is there in the
you know what you did.
the outline, and you can reach out to me however you want. And in the meantime, I look forward to joining together next week as we continue on with the development of the Jewish people. Everyone have a great week.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.